Hey, welcome to the Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. It's glad to have you with us this week once again. And we have been going through a series at our church called The Trouble Is, and we've been dealing with some difficult questions that you've been asking. And we've not been shying away from those difficult topics, and we've been diving deep into some of these questions. And this week is no different. On Sunday, we discussed something called the Christ myth. And if you were there on Sunday morning, you realize there was a lot of information. And we wanted to dig a bit deeper. That's the purpose of these videos, is to kind of dig deeper into some of these subjects and cover some of the questions that might have arisen on Sunday morning that we weren't able to cover. And if you have missed any of these on the series called The Trouble Is, we invite you to go whitefieldschurch.com. And we're also on SoundCloud and on Facebook, and get caught up and just kind of get into some of these questions and hear some of the answers that we have been discussing. But we're here with Pastor Nick once again, and he covered a lot of information on Sunday, but we want to cover a little bit more today based on this topic called the Christ myth. And one of the things you talked about on Sunday was primary sources, where this information came from. And for me, I remember I read this blog post just probably a month or so ago that somebody had sent me about some guy wrote a whole long piece about the fact that there's zero evidence of the fact that Abraham existed. So if Abraham didn't exist, that means the entire history of the children of Israel did not exist, which means David didn't exist, which meant basically it's all baloney and we shouldn't believe it. And then as you drill down into his post and you get down to his footnotes and where he gets all his information from, is that you find he just read a book by some guy, and he wrote this whole entire expose based on this one book, basically discounting centuries of archaeological discovery, of historians, of encyclopedias of information on this particular topic, and people don't necessarily go and do that a deeper dive. And you mentioned that about these primary sources, and I just wonder if you talk a little bit more about that today.
Yeah, and so nobody reads footnotes in general. I mean, the scholarly community, that was one of the things I talked about on Sunday, was that I quoted this guy named Bart Ehrman, and Bart Ehrman is not a Christian. In fact, he used to be a Christian, but he's not a Christian. And his not being a Christian, though, has nothing to do with the fact of his historical studies. So he is a professor of history in University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And so he has written a lot about the historical Jesus. And what he has said is that this idea of the Christ myth, one of the quotes I read on Sunday, he said this idea of the Christ myth is a modern myth of the Christ myth. He said there's no historical precedent for it until the 18th century. And at that time, it was kind of the first appearance of this idea was from two French writers, and then there wasn't a lot written on this idea again until about the 20th century. And what I had said is that if you look at these things like Zeitgeist, or you look at these other, the God Who Was Never There, or Bill Maher's Religulous, a lot of people aren't reading the footnotes. But if you do read the footnotes on these, you'll find that all of the footnotes in almost all of them trace back to one source, and it's not a primary source. It's this guy named Gerald Massey, who wrote a book about the Christ conspiracy, basically based on this whole idea that Christians borrowed all their ideas about Jesus from existing myths and religions. Jesus never existed, and so on. And Massey did not use primary sources to get his ideas. In fact, many of his ideas, he was asked by people who do study in these fields, where are your sources? And he said, well, I got it all from this book called The Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is kind of it's the go-to book for Egyptian mythology. It explains a lot of stuff. It's very ancient. And there are actual people called Egyptologists. That's what they spend their entire career, their entire life is devoted to this subject. And they are looking at this and they say, well, actually, hey, we read that book and the stuff you're saying is not in that book. And his reply was, oh, yeah, actually, I got it from somewhere else, but I don't remember where I got it from. And they just left it at that. So they're not using primary sources. Again, Bart Ehrman makes it very clear. In the scholarly community, nobody takes this seriously. The problem is that not everybody is in the scholarly community, and a lot of this information is being given out on the, everyman type of platforms, so like YouTube and Facebook and things like that, with people who aren't taking the time to dig deep into this. And so that's how this information spreads, is because somebody asserts it as if it's fact. People don't bother to check their sources, and people make conclusions based on things which, unfortunately, are not based on actual primary sources.
And one of those things you talked about this in one of your blogs around Easter time was this meme that was going around regarding Ishtar and its correlation with Easter, and you talked about this as people just don't read into it. And what was the conspiracy with that one?
Yeah, so this whole thing about Ishtar, actually, it's funny thing is that I had heard this years ago, that, the word Easter comes from Ishtar, which is some kind of, Mesopotamian, Middle Eastern goddess, and it's a goddess of fertility, and, all of the things that we do at Easter time with the eggs and with the bunny and all that, it's all, pagan in origin and all that. And what's funny is that I actually started doing some research on this to find out what's true, and I actually expected to find that part was true. And I found out just the opposite, because this meme had said some things which were blatantly not true, like that Constantine changed the date of Easter, in 300 something AD, which is blatantly false. I mean, we know that Christians celebrated Easter. It's based on the Jewish calendar, the Jewish lunar calendar. We did a video about this a couple weeks ago, and the date of Easter hasn't changed. That's actually why the date of Easter changes every year for us within a window of time. It's because it's based on a lunar calendar, and we use a solar calendar. Whatever. The point is that the date of Easter has not changed. But what I found was even more interesting, and what I found was that actually the word Easter doesn't come from Ishtar. It comes from a German word which means spring, which again is not pagan. So then another thing I found out was that the Easter egg tradition is also not pagan. That actually comes from Orthodox Christianity, where they wouldn't eat eggs during Lent. And so what they would do is at the end of the Lenten fast, which was Easter, they would prepare a bunch of boiled eggs, and then they started doing things like decorating those eggs or playing games with kids with the eggs, hiding the eggs, go find the eggs. And that's how we got this whole Easter egg tradition. In other words, that was a Christian thing which came out of a practice of Lent. It was not a pagan thing about fertility. And then the thing about the Easter bunny was really funny. That actually came from Germany in the 1800s. They had this thing called the Easter bunny, and it was invented for, I know this is going to be shocking, it was invented for fun. And apparently we're not allowed to have fun without it being pagan anymore, but actually it wasn't even pagan in origin either. The Easter bunny was just for fun. So, you can see people just say, hey, that was this or that, and we're like, we just kind of take it at face value. It's not as much fun to do research, but oftentimes very worthwhile.
Yes, exactly. And this is what we're all about with these video series, is kind of try and do some of this research. And one of the things you talked about also on Sunday morning was the idea of the date Christmas. One of the things that all of these other gods had in common was the fact that they were born on December 25th. And you did some research into that as well.
Yeah, what I shared with that is that Christians have never believed that Jesus was born on December 25th. We know for a fact that it was in the late 300s that Pope Julius I moved the celebration of Jesus' birth to December 25th, which is also the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. And the reason he did it was to subvert kind of a hanging on pagan holiday called Saturnalia, which was celebrated on the winter solstice. And people were still, even though a lot of people had become Christians, they were still persisting in celebrating this solstice pagan thing. And he said, you know what, we're going to change the meaning of that, and we're going to celebrate Jesus' birth on that day. And so one of the questions that we got in response to the sermon was, somebody asked, well, does that mean that in the past, before that time, Christmas had a different date? And the answer to that is that Christmas was celebrated by some parts of the church because there wasn't complete consensus. These people were spread out. They didn't have, it was oftentimes difficult for them to communicate easily. And so there were certain parts of the church that did celebrate Jesus' birth at different times. But as a whole, there was no such thing as Christmas like we think of it, as a set holiday when you celebrate Jesus' birth. And because we didn't know the actual date of Jesus' birth, we just know that it probably wasn't in the winter. And so a lot of Christians probably didn't celebrate Christmas at all until that point. What they did is they all celebrated the resurrection of Jesus. So we know that for sure. That was the big holiday. Christmas was kind of added on later as a celebration of his birth. And I think it's a wonderful thing. We should absolutely celebrate the fact that God became incarnate. I mean, that's a huge thing. As to when we do it, it's a bit arbitrary. They chose this date in order to subvert a pagan holiday. Whether that was good or bad, I don't know. But I definitely know that I'm not celebrating pagan things on when I celebrate the birth of Jesus. So.
Exactly. And yeah, I was, this subject was, I was wondering about Sunday, like people are going to think about the Christ myth, and this is such a big topic, and whoever thinks about this, but the response we've had to the sermon was like people were really super engaged with this idea and just kind of, thinking about the facts. Facts matter. Where our faith comes, it matters. And so I really encourage you, if you missed Sunday morning, to go and download the podcast or go listen online, whitefieldschurch.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you turn on the notifications, the little bell, or like us, follow us on Facebook so you can get the next videos. And we just, engage with us as we will try to answer your questions as they come along. And we appreciate you having with us this week, and God bless you all.